Hi there. Today I want to take a few minutes to talk about four of my favorite vintage military revolvers. Two are Swiss, and one is Swedish, and one is Norwegian. They all take effectively the same cartridge, and I'll talk about the cartridge and what I do to load for them. This first one is a Swiss 1882 revolver. This particular one is a 3-digit serial number, so it's fairly early. All four of these revolvers are extremely well made, excellent shooters. All of these revolvers with the same ammo that I'm loading. At 25 yards standing, two-handed shooting for, multiple strings. I'm getting, sub 2-inch groups in general, and usually it's limited just by the sights and sight picture. This one has a bead front sight. But extremely good shooting guns, very low recoil, and a lot of fun to shoot, but really finely crafted revolvers. So this first one is, again, the Swiss 1892. It's a 7.5 millimeter cartridge, so about 32 caliber. The way this operates is fairly simple. You have a loading gate that moves to the rear. Now this is a similar loading gate that you can find on other revolvers, where it disconnects the hammer from the cylinder when the loading gate is back. That allows you to pull the trigger and index the cylinder for loading or unloading. So I have already made sure that this pistol is unloaded, but I've moved the loading gate back. I'm going to rotate the ejector rod around, and you can see that when I pull the trigger, it just rotates the cylinder, allows me to push and push the empty cartridge out, or to load cartridges into the pistol. It's a double action, single action design. The early ones had these plastic or composite type grips. The other side, I think, usually has the Swiss marking, and there's a lanyard on the butt. I'll pull this up. These have an octagon barrel, or a half octagon barrel, I guess. Really, the extension's not octagon. It has a bead front sight and a rounded U-notch rear sight. You can see on this, it's still got a little bit of the straw color on the hammer and the trigger, and also on the ejector rod. This one has the Waffen Fabrik Bern stamp, along with the serial number and the proof marks. These are fairly easy to clean. In general, if you want to pull the cylinder out, basically you just open up the ejector rod, and that allows you to pull the base pin out, and the cylinder then comes out fairly easily. Additionally, if you want, you can unscrew the large screw up above the grip. That's a captive screw, so that won't come out. And that allows you to rotate the lower part of the frame and trigger guard open and carefully lift up the grip. Now the earlier model is kind of neat. It has this little screwable in pin that you can unscrew, and that helps allow you to take this one lower spring out, and the V-spring and the rest of the parts can come out. Very easy. You don't really need to take those parts out. The parts that you can tell, I mean, it's very easy to clean, and the parts are very well made. You can see the little set screw in here, maybe you can't, that holds the disassembly screw captive in the frame. Very simple, very nicely made. You want to be careful with these composite early grips, since they are a little bit fragile. And then to reassemble, just tighten that down. I'm going to get the base pin started here. Loading gate still open. Drop the cylinder down into place. Push the base pin back in, rotate your ejector rod, close the loading gate, and that's all done and ready to go. Okay, the next revolver I wanted to talk about is the Swiss 1929 revolver. So this one replaced the 1882. The Swiss had also manufactured and purchased Luger revolvers, and then after this, of course, they had the Sig 210 and various other pistols to this day. The basic changes for this revolver, I'll show the other one next to it, is the grip shape changed, and the barrel and the front sight and the finish changed slightly. So the 1929 had a more pronounced curve to the back strap, had composite grips, and it has a round barrel, not an octagon or a half octagon. And then it has a Partridge style front sight. You can see that, and just and still a rounded U notch. But this Partridge front sight is quite a bit easier to be precise with, and it's also dovetailed, so you can do some fine windage adjustment with that sight. The grip, even though it's fairly sharply angled, I like the way it works. It lines up pretty well, at least for my hands. And again, that Partridge sight is a little bit clearer to see than the bead front sight. Again, this revolver operates in a similar manner. Open the loading gate, pull out rotate the ejector rod, and then you can just rotate the cylinder by hand, poke out the empty cartridges, or load rounds in it. Now, generally when you're loading or unloading, having your finger on the trigger is a bad idea, so you need to think about what you're doing, especially in a range situation. Make sure that the pistol is pointed downrange in a safe direction, because you are putting your finger on the trigger, and make sure that nobody's freaking out, that you know why you're doing that. This revolver takes down in a similar fashion. Again, you rotate the ejector rod out, and the little spring here actually goes into a detent on the cylinder base pin. So you actually have to rotate the ejector rod. There's another notch that it can go into. You rotate it, and it basically pulls this little spring up and clears for the base pin to pull forward. You can see the little notch here that spring actually sits in as well. So once that's there, and you have the base pin out far enough, then the cylinder should pull out. Nope. So then putting it back together, sometimes you may have to fiddle with this a little bit. The cylinder you have to rotate and kind of futz with to make sure that that back end actually gets all the way down into where the recess is for the hand to make access. So then you can just put the ejector rod all the way in, and then once the base pin, and then once the ejector rod is rotated, then that pin is held captive, so it can't come loose. So that's how you put that back together. Disassembly. Now this one, the screws on the other side of the frame. It's captive with that frame piece. And once you have that out, now it doesn't rotate, it just pivots and comes off. There's a little detent pin in here, and the frame part comes off, and then the grip pulls up and off. It also has a lanyard, just like the other design. You can see matte finished pieces, still very, very simple design. They've simplified this extra piece here that's a spring for the hand, I believe, and then that's now one piece with the V-spring. So they made the design a little bit simpler, not as finely finished looking, but still utilitarian. So I'll put that grip back on. Frame back on, the side plate. Screw that back together and close the loading gate, and we're back in business again. All right. Next revolver. This is a Swedish 1887 model Nagant revolver. So this functions and takes down almost identically to the Russian Nagant revolvers that have come in that are fairly inexpensive, or at least were fairly inexpensive. This model, finely checkered wood grips, does have a nice large lanyard on it. Again, the trigger and hammer loading gate and the little side spring here, which puts spring tension for the loading gate, are still straw colored, as well as the ejector rod. Really nicely made. A lot of times you'll see some discoloration in the finish here. This was generally when they either ground off or changed the unit marking that goes on the side. I believe this one is remarked for a reserve, or like a home guard unit. Very pretty checkering on the hammer. Again, the wood is nicely checkered. The finish is typically a very nice blue. This was made by Husqvarna, and operating this fairly simple. You give the ejector rod about a half turn, pull it out, and then the ejector rod rotates around and then stops. And if you open the loading gate, then if the cylinder was aligned, then you can poke out the empty cartridges and rotate to the next one, etc. To pull the cylinder out, then you just need to make sure that the ejector rod housing is clear, and then you pull the base pin out, and then the cylinder comes out. Fairly simple. Usually I don't go any further with this. There's no real need to take the side plate off. To clean them. You can take the screws out, take the grips off, and do all that if you really want to. So basically just rotate that back around, give it a half turn until the ejector rod stops, and then you're all ready to go, and you close the loading gate. You can see the front of the grip here, the wood actually protrudes through. Very, very nicely made. Triggers are fairly good on these. These particular sights are a rear V-notch and a kind of tapered inverted V front sight. So it's got a flat top on it. It's fairly good for shootability and for aiming. Really nicely made revolvers. Okay, the last one here, this is a Norwegian contract Nagant. So this is a model 1893. Norway purchased about 10,000 of these. I believe they made some themselves at Husqvarna and maybe one other arsenal. These are effectively identical to the Swedish Nagant, but these were made primarily under contract. You can see on the crane, trying to get a good reflection here, it says Brevet Nagant. So this was made by Nagant in Belgium under contract for Norway. Now really the only way to tell that it's a Norwegian contract is the crown over N here, and the front sight being a sort of half patridge notch on the front sight compared to the Swedish revolvers. This also has a V notch in the rear. It operates in the same manner. You open the loading gate, give the ejector rod a half turn, pull it out, rotate it around out of the way, and then you'd pull the base pin out if you wanted to disassemble it, or just line up your cylinder and eject the cartridges. Again, when you're finished, rotate it back around, give it a half turn. Again, just like the Swiss one, it's got a half octagon barrel. Also, very finely made. Nice bluing on these, nice finely checkered grips. Has the same kind of checkering on the front strap of the wood that sticks through the frame. Nice lanyard on it. These actually have blued parts for the hammer, ejector, loading gate, and trigger, as opposed to straw colored parts, and the spring is also blued here. Typically those won't have a unit mark on them like the Swiss revolver, so I guess, or the Swedish revolver, so I guess those are signs of a contract or a non-Swedish revolver, or the lack of straw colored parts, the notched front sight, and the lack of unit markings on there, and then of course the brevet Nagant mark. Really the crown over N is what differentiates that in the front sight from being another contract type Nagant. Typically the Nagant revolvers don't have serial numbers on the cylinders. Very nice revolvers, good triggers, shoot just extremely well. I'm getting them to shoot with the same load in all 4 pistols. They shoot very close to point of aim. I may be having to hold just a little bit high or a little bit low depending on what the distance is, but fairly well centered, and nicely made guns. The Norwegian ones are fairly unusual and fairly hard to come by, so if you find one, snap it up. The person I got this one from, it was fairly well dirty and tarnished, and it was in a batch of Russian Nagant revolvers, and the seller, I don't think, knew what it was. So he got it for a very good price, cleaned it up, and knew that I had a hankering for Nagant revolvers. Okay, I'll talk about loading just a little bit. So this is a loaded cartridge that I'm using. Now this particular cartridge casing is 7.5 Swiss revolver. I got these from Graf & Sons several years ago when they had them in stock. The casing is cut to a little bit shorter than 1 inch in length, and as an alternative, before I was able to get these particular casings, I used a 3220 brass that was cut down to around 7/8 of an inch or so. I just had to make sure that it would chamber fully in all 4 guns. You could also use 7.65 Nagant revolver brass if you have reloadable brass for that, and trim it down as well. For the bullet, I'm using a hollow base 98 grain Lapua soft lead bullet, and the only thing that you need to concern yourself with when you're using 3220 brass is that some of the 3220 brass manufacturing, so the rim is slightly too thick for the Swedish Nagant revolvers, and so I had to use a file and just take a few licks off of the base of the cases to make sure that they didn't drag when the cylinder rotated. Now, typically on the cases you've got a little bit of recess room for the primer, and taking just a little bit off the base doesn't really do anything, and you're not going to have the primer sitting out proud and drag on the cylinder, but that is an option. Now to actually reload these, I'm using a mix of dies because that's what I've had. Now I've got a 7.62 Nagant revolver sizing die, and that's what I use to size the cases. I found that 32 long sizing die doesn't quite size the base down far enough. So I use that as the sizing and depriming die. And then I'm using a 32 Smith & Wesson expander, and primarily I'm using that because these are .314 diameter bullets, and the 32 Smith & Wesson long expander expands them sufficiently for that. And then I'm using the 32 Smith & Wesson long die to seat and give a slight roll crimp for the brass. I'm using right at 2 grains of bullseye, so fairly light load. Now on some of these revolvers, on the I think especially the Swedes, they used a heeled bullet, so the outer diameter of the bullet was actually the same diameter as the casing, and so you may worry about accuracy in these pistols. But I found that using these soft .314 hollow base bullets, they flare out plenty good and they seal the revolver barrel, and they shoot extremely well. I'm getting, like I said, 2.5 inch groups offhand at 25 yards with these, so they'll shoot plenty good. I've never had any problem with spitting or accuracy with these revolvers, so I've actually used the same exact load in my Russian Nagant revolvers, and again, you may worry about the accuracy because in the Russian Nagant revolvers, the cylinder, basically the front of the cylinder is much wider because it slides over the rear end of the barrel, and the bullet has to make a fairly long jump, but I've had no problems with them shooting these guns. As far as the length, I'm loading the cartridge to be just at cylinder length, so actually I took whatever it's slightly shorter, I guess, here, so I have it sticking out maybe about 3/16 of an inch, and that's worked fine in all of these pistols. You can if the bullet is longer, you can seat it out to cylinder length, or you can actually have the cartridge be a little bit longer and have the whole thing be right at cylinder length. But I've had it these particular size. When I was saying cylinder length, that's when I was cutting my own brass from 3220. I just cut it short enough so that the cartridge and the loaded ammo would be cylinder length. But these 7.5 Swiss cartridges are slightly shorter, so I just loaded them out about 3/16 of an inch, enough for me to get a little bit of a roll crimp so that they don't move under recoil. But this round has worked very well with that loading, and has shot well on all 4 of these guns. So there you go, some interesting early revolvers that you're still able to find. Prices are not too terrible on these. The workmanship, first rate. Shoot very well. They were generally well taken care of. They're a little bit dorky looking, but I kind of like that. But it gives you an alternative to other vintage firearms. Several of these are antique. So the Swiss 1882, depending on when it was made, is an antique. The Swedish revolver is also an antique. The Norwegian pistols, if you look up serial numbers, sometimes you'll find post 1900 or post 1899. These were actually all made under contract in around 1895 to 97, I believe. So they were all pre-1898, but they weren't accepted. They were delivered in batches starting in 1899, I think. So these should be classified as antiques. The one that would not would be the Swiss 1929. That's still CNR, a curio and relic. So hopefully you found that interesting. Thanks.